The speaker today is Professor Karen Pinto, one of my cherished colleagues of Columbia University, and a student of the one and only Professor Richard Bullitt. Well, this was almost 30 years ago. At the moment, Karen is the Associate Scholar of Religious Studies in the University of Colorado-Boulder, and she has actually a sort of a resume, a CV that puts some of us in shame. She has, for one thing, her first book won the Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Title. She has been she has gotten the award of Inaugural Inclusivity and Diversity Award of the Medieval Academy of America. She has gotten NEH fellowships, William and Flora Hewlett Grant, Social Science and Humanities Council of Canada Fellowship, the J.B. Harley's Research Fellowship in the History of Cartography at the British Library, the American Research Institute in Turkey, the Social Science Research Council Dissertation Award, Ibn Khaldun Prize in the Social Sciences Research Council, and finally, I mean, when she was a student at Columbia, the Richard Hofstadter Fellowship from the Department of History at Columbia University. I personally would like you to inform you that Karen is one of the first people to work on Islamic cartography in a very serious manner. As you will see, she's sitting on a treasure trove of Islamic maps, and really a treasure trove of Islamic maps. And she had this is basically has become like some of us with our work. This is basically her passion, her work, and it has consumed, basically about 30 years of her life. So I am really looking forward, and I'm sure we are all looking forward, Karen, to your presentation. It is just wonderful to have you, and I am going to ask you to start without further ado, because a lot of people are waiting to hear what you have to say to us. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you for accepting our invitation. We are delighted to have you. So this is now, as they say in Persian, I leave you with the GUI and the Maidan. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Parvaneh. It's a great honor, and I'm so grateful. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm doing actually something a little bit different. I'm doing a combo. So we'll have the PowerPoint, but we'll also have a little bit of a document in the back that I want to share. I've got some pieces to share with you. So we've been trying to unclutter the screen for this limited amount of time here. So wonderful to see. I can see a few people, including our amazing advisor. So can you see this easily, or is this in the way? Is this
looks good?
Is this listing in the way? No? Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to thank everybody, and especially Parvaneh Pourshariati, who we were colleagues and as graduate students with the great Richard Bullitt, and it was quite the honor, and we all had a lot of good time, and learned a lot from each other. So this is a great honor to be invited and to be asked to participate. So I'm going to move on. It might be, yes. Okay, so I found this very interesting, and I wanted to start with this. I love the poster that Parvaneh put together for this presentation, and I love the fact that she picked this image of me in Pakistan, in Karachi, Pakistan. I was invited to give a talk. So I'm originally from Karachi, Pakistan, and I think in looking back and as I was putting this talk together, thinking about the influences that I have and that have affected me growing up in Pakistan was one of my biggest influences. I think that I bring that difference to the table. There was a lot of internal mapping that I grew up with. We didn't have a lot of street maps. I started driving very young, atrociously young age of 12 and a half. So, you know, figuring out the big city, etc. Many reasons, I think, why I got into the wonders of Islamic maps. So how did this happen, and when did this happen? I'm hoping everybody can see the top of that. So I came from Pakistan. I was very fortunate. I came to Dartmouth. I got a fellowship at Dartmouth. I did geography and history. In Pakistan growing up, I did a lot of geography, and being South Asia and having influence from the colonial influences of England. There was a big emphasis on geography, so I grew up a lot with mapping and making maps myself. And then I went to Dartmouth, and I did the first major I did was geography, and I got that done in 2 years. And so then I did history, and that was when I married geography and history. And then I came to Columbia, and I started off in the School of International and Public Affairs, and I was actually I did an internship at the UN, and I was heading to the UN. And by, the accident of life, of fate, of karma, I ended up working with Professor Bullitt on the Iranian Studies Journal. I did a lot of desktop publishing on the side to survive as a student. And so I got hired by him to work on the Iranian Studies Journal, and I found him to be fascinating. So I thought, well, as a student of the international affairs student, I could take an elective. And so I did. I took this elective with him on Islamic history, and that was it. My life changed. I went from being a modernist, an ultra-modernist working on the UN and matters related to the UN and refugees, to becoming a medievalist and becoming a medieval Islamicist. And Richard Bullitt has this side of him. He's done that to quite a few students. There are a number of students he took out of SIPA. There was another student called Stuart Bosch who would been in the Gulf War, and he joined, etc. So I made the switch from SIPA to the history department in 1989. That was the fall of 1989. And there was another unusual coincidence. You know how, as I said, how life is all about coincidences. And that coincidence was the joining of the person who joined the history department was Olivia Ramey Constable. And she was just fresh out of her dissertation and finishing her dissertation. Her area of work was the Mediterranean world and Mediterranean trade. And so she joined for the first time. It was literally it was her first job as an assistant professor at Columbia, and I was her first graduate student. And I don't know those who know Olivia Ramey Constable or have heard of her. She went from Columbia to Notre Dame, and she passed away very tragically young and early. And it has been a source of great sadness for me that she's gone. And in fact, the book that I'm finishing right now, which is on the Mediterranean, which is something I started with her, I'm going to be dedicating to her memory, because she was an amazing person. So And the beauty of this talk that Parvaneh has asked me to give is it's enabled me to be a little bit autobiographical about, you know, what the process was of discovery and then what I did with these maps. It's sort of opened the door to that. And that's sort of why I'm going back to the very beginning point where I found these maps. And Remy said to me, so I was, you know, her first graduate student. This was her first class at Columbia, and she taught a class in Mediterranean studies. And, you know, the regular students had the regular work, but I had to do, you know, serious graduate level, you know, work. And so she says to me, I said, so Remy, what should I do as a topic for you? And she says to me, she says, well, how about the geographers? You know, have you explored the geographers? And I thought, no, you know, I should go explore the geographers, because with Professor Bullitt, we were doing mostly history. So she sent me off to the Butler Library stacks. And I remember, you know, the section over there, you know, and anybody has spent time in Columbia Library stacks, you know, the rows are very narrow, and there are these lights that go on, and, you know, they have like a 15-minute or 10-minute cycle. So you stick paper there to keep them going. So I went off to the section where they have the geography books, and I was walking around, and something hit me on the leg, and it was Conrad Miller's set of black and white maps from the 1920s in a very fragile state, sticking out of the stack. And so it hit me on the leg, and I went down and I bent down and I pulled it out, and then I sat there for, I don't know, what seems like, looking back, an eternity, you know. I mean, I don't remember the date. It was somewhere fall 1989, and nobody had published on these maps yet. In fact, the History of Cartography volume came out after I finished my essay. So like, what are these, you know, these strange shapes, and, you know, what is this? And that started me on the work with these maps. And now I go to why we have this strange situation here, where I've got both the PowerPoint and I've got some of my publications. And that set me on the track of my first piece that I did on these maps, which was the Mediterranean and the medieval Muslim cartographical imagination. I did it as my master's essay. It became sort of a classic. A lot of people know about it. A lot of people have used it. It won a major prize. It won the SSRC, Social Science Research Council Essay Award for graduate students. And it represented sort of my first foray into this material. Now, I haven't shared this online, as I will explain in a few minutes, and perhaps after my book comes out, I think I will. But, you know, this is where I first came up with these very unusual ways of looking at these maps. And I have to thank Richard Bullitt and Remy Constable for really guiding me on this. And I remember the first essay I produced. So I did the paper for Remy, and then we decided it was really good, and I was going to move forward to do my master's essay as part of my graduate student requirements. And I did one version of it, and they said, okay, now go back to the writing table and write again. And so I wrote the whole thing a second time. And this is all because of the wonderful guidance of amazing professors in my life. I'm so fortunate in that way. So many people have been so good to me. So this is where I started thinking about shape and size and conception of space and perspective and orientation and symbols and the significance of writing and the construction of boundaries and the various, and I also produced at the end, I did a lot of the maps. So you can see some of these were the maps that I was working with. They're pretty stylized, you know, not in a very good way, in a black and white. And I was even putting some forms together where I was piecing pieces together, doing lots of innovative stuff. But one of the things that's very distinctive about this material is that Conrad Miller, who did this work in the 1920s, dated all these maps by the original date of the author. So for instance, this one is not 10th century at all, it's 19th century. And what I did after succeeding with this is, and I go back now to the PowerPoint, is I went to the libraries. So I went from doing this work with this set, which was the only thing available at that point in 1989, 1990. I finished the essay, I believe, 1991, and then it won the prize in 1992. And then I went to the manuscript libraries, and so I thought I'd put a few pictures on a slide here of going to Topkapi Sarai and working in the libraries in Topkapi Sarai, and that's where I collected. I became a macro photographer, and I learned how to do my own photographs, and that's why I collected more than 3,000 images of maps, which is something that is a major collection, and this is what Parvaneh was talking about at the outset. So this is outside the library, is over there, so it's taking a break. This is the Suleimania Library and the reading room, if anybody's been there. I sat under that bust over there. There's one seat there, and I used to worry about this thing falling. I remember I spent a lot of time looking at catalogs. It took me about 6 months to get into the libraries, which was a very good thing, because when you spend time looking at catalogs, you really get all the details, of what it is you're going to look at down. So by the time I got my permission, I was rearing to go. I spent about 2 years in Istanbul, but I've also been to libraries around the world. I've been to Bodleian and the British Library and the BNF in Paris, and I've been to the libraries in Germany. I've been to CBL in Dublin. That's one of the things I do, is go to library and manuscripts, and I've become a major manuscriptist. I'm a specialist in dating and in identification, etc. And then I thought here I would put, just as a small side note, in case there's anybody in the audience who's interested in swords, I also got amazing access to something that is very rarely given access to. In fact, I don't know who's got access since I had access, and that is to this so-called sacred sword collection at Topkapi Sarai. I was working on, I was asked by the head of IRSICA, Isan Ekmeladin, Isanolu, who helped me get my permission. And in exchange, I agreed to help with the editing and translation, actually, of a book that had been written on Islamic swords in Arabic into English. And when I went to work on that book, I realized that all the data was very old, was from the 1950s. And so I asked for access, and I got measurements of swords and rubbings, including the famous sword of David. And yes, I've worked with the prophet swords that people see in the windows, and I have all of that information, but I'm so busy with maps. So if anybody's interested, please. So I'm hoping this is visible. So this is kind of an overview of my Lightroom catalog. I was thinking of taking a more recent picture, but it'll give you a sense of, I basically collected, I've got tons of manuscripts, I've got tons of maps. As I said, I photographed the bulk of the collection in both Topkapi Sarai and Suleimania libraries, but I also have collections from elsewhere. And one of the things that I noticed soon after I started researching the material in the libraries was that Conrad Miller had the dates all wrong. So as I was showing you earlier in that document, he was dating all the maps by the original death date, which is how we do in Islamic history, we date by death date. He was dating everything by the original, by the death date of the original author. And actually, we don't have any autographed copies from the original authors. So his entire collection is misdated. So one of the things I've been doing with my work has been redating the collection. And I redate and I put the correct dates in my publications. But I'm also thinking now more and more that I really need to just put down a catalog of the images with the correct dates so that people can use the correct dates, because I see that the incorrect dates still float around in a lot of recent work. So one of the things I noticed, and I was testing this out yesterday, noticed I can do this fantastic thing, which is I can go and I can do this. So one of the things I noticed as I was working with this material is I started to see that they were clusters. So even on screen, I think even the audience should be able to see that these images look the same. So if you start to look, and I'm going to go over what the details of the maps, but just the basic outlines, you can start to see like this one's different, but these are very similar. And this similarity struck me. And then the other thing that struck me was the relationship between these two. And that ended up being my first paper. And I think now I undo it and I move back to, I moved back to this. So that ended up, so as I said, I redated these maps. All his dates were all the Miller dates are wrong. And there are a lot of wrong dates roaming around in the material. So it's very important. So that's what happened. And I figured out these were, I checked the colophon and I realized that this was a very nice piece I did with the Magamundi where we put this all down here and we put down this, the details. And what I noticed is all the colophons indicated that the work was done about, that these copies were made about 10 or 20 years after Mehmet the Conqueror had conquered Constantinople. And so I started thinking about why, and from that emerged this paper on the Ottoman cluster, which ended up also going into my dissertation and then my book, where I have a whole section looking at these maps as an example of patronage, so that we start to understand, because when the copies are no longer the copies of the original author, but copies that are made 5 or 6 centuries later, we need to be understanding why these copies were still being made and who was promoting them, who was projecting them, who was, and so my whole paper is about what happened and why these were being copied. So what I theorize is that Mehmet was reconstituting Constantinople, setting up libraries, doing a lot of things, and he needed to put books in his libraries. And so I think he felt, maybe this is my idea, that he may have felt that this map worked for his interests. And he also had over the gates of the palace, the emperor of the 2 seas. And so, there's many ways in which you can read an advantage for him to do that. So back to the PowerPoint. So this is what I identified as a cluster, and then I identified this as the mother manuscript that spawned this cluster. And this was apparently, as I deduced from working with the manuscripts, a gift from the Akkoyunlu leader to Mehmet II, because one of the younger members of the Akkoyunlu, his nephew had been kidnapped, and this was in southeastern Anatolia, and the area of approximately southeastern Anatolia, northern Syria and Iraq, that area, and a ransom had been demanded by Mehmet, which included Murakka and illuminated manuscripts. And so I theorized that this came with that and then spawned the cluster that Mehmet had requested. So this resulted in me moving from the Mediterranean maps, as I showed you with that piece, to primarily work on the world maps. And the world maps then came to figure as the central structure for the central piece. The world maps are the central pieces of my doctoral dissertation, and then of the book that I wrote on medieval Islamic maps, which I was very fortunate to have won a prize, and it was very well received. And using these maps as alternate gateways into the past, as iconic ideographs that contain very valuable messages that can be unpacked to reveal different things. That's what I'm going to talk about now in the rest of the talk, with ways in which I approach these maps. And I've developed unique methodologies, not because because I was so busy trying to figure out how to understand the maps, that the methodologies emerged out of that effort to unpack them. And I think one way to think about it is sometimes I think, after 3 decades of doing this, sometimes I think I'm in the middle of these maps, and I pop my head up somewhere and it's like, well, why is this here? What's that then? And whole papers and books emerge from that. Okay, so I will get to the book in a little while, but I thought this is something that a lot of people really like, and I like to do this so that a general audience that's never seen these maps before can start to understand, how is this a map of the world? This is a map that most people have never seen or heard of. And I think part of my, what I bring to the table is I am intrigued by maps like this that are not openly and obviously maps. And this has become my specialty, to go find maps that don't look like maps and explain what they're showing and why they came to be. So this is the one that was done for the Ottoman cluster, and I find it quite simple to use this one to explain. So the number one thing is, of course, south is at top. So this is an interesting issue that many of us run into. When I'm teaching this in my classes, I tell, when I do my class on the history of mapping, I do a pre-modern mapping class, I tell all my students to please go back to their dorm rooms or wherever they live and turn every map they know in any direction but north on top for the rest of the semester, and leave it there and put it on the walls, wherever, so that you can start seeing the world in a different way. Because we see one particular image of the world, and that image is the world with north on top, and that has become imprinted in our minds, and it's very hard for us to see a different kind of world. And one of the examples that I like to give my students to, and I recommend to everyone, recently I discovered that you can see the space, the ISS, the International Space Station. I don't know if you know this. If you go to YouTube, you can put the channel on. I'm too busy to watch TV, but just to have something in the background, I'll have that. And the beauty of it is this idea that pre-modern mapping and the most ultra form of mapping kind of meet. Because if you ever look at that, you find yourself puzzling all the time. How is this, North America, or how is this Atlantic, or it's just incredible. It's also a puzzle, and it's the puzzle of these things that is so fascinating. So blue is the seas, white is the landmass, south is on top. This is, of course, the world pre the discovery of the Americas, so no Americas involved here. And the Atlantic and Pacific are one. And as I tell my students when I teach, the Atlantic and Pacific are still one. It's just the way that we have divided up the Atlantic and Pacific into separate oceans that is a modern phenomena. But if you go look at a Google Earth map, and if you set it at the right direction, you'll see that we still have an encircling ocean. So I like to say the encircling ocean hasn't gone away. So then turn your maps upside down, cut off the Americas, right? And now you have south on top, right? And you start to sort of see the parallels a little bit, right? You start to see Africa, and you start to see Europe right here, right? And then this bulge here, which is the Arabian Peninsula here, and then the bulk of it here, which is Asia, and you start to see that. And while I was, again, when we do these things and we end up with these accidents, I ended up with this accident where I skewed the same image. And the interesting thing about this is I've never been able to replicate this. I tried to do something like this on my book, and they needed higher res, and it was really very difficult. This was an accident. That image that I just showed you, I just skewed it just like this a little bit. And you can start to see when you have an overextended Africa, which joins with Australia, you start to get this. It is pretty amazing. I mean, if you think, the earliest form of this image, which is another thing I've been working on, is the time in the maps, and what was the earliest form and when was it put down. As I said, Conrad Miller misdated the maps to the original date of the authors, but what we still don't know is what was the earliest version, when was the earliest version put down. And one way to figure this out is through the internal data. You look at places that are on the maps, and places that no longer exist and would have only been had been put on a map at a certain point, things like that. So I do a lot of work with places on maps, etc. That's another thing that I specialize in. So then you can start to see how this equates to the world we actually know in a way. I mean, this is being done before satellites, right? Before aircraft and airplanes. My brother, the pilot, is here, so I'm very influenced by air travel as well. I have two brothers in the aviation industry. And you start to see, and so then you get into the process of identifying the places, what's what, looking at Africa. Clearly, Africa is very, very privileged in the Islamic conception of the world, right? And today, when we look at the history and we think, well, why weren't they busy conquering Europe, right? I mean, Europe is of such great significance. Well, and we don't really get much. I mean, there was an ongoing effort to dislodge the Byzantines. It took about 6 centuries until Mehmed finally conquers Constantinople. But there really wasn't that much interest in Europe, because in the Muslim conception of Europe, Europe is just this marooned little triangle, right? It doesn't have much space. There's not much to get on it. You want to get something, you want to get Africa, right? Africa is where you've got the open space. And then you look at Asia, and Asia is so chopped up. It's so intensely carved out, right? There's all these tribes, the Rus, because the Arabian Peninsula is very interesting. You have Iraq and the Euphrates. In Africa, you have the Nile. The rivers are very clearly marked. Then you have all these Iranian provinces. You have the Indus River, the Aral Sea, the Caspian Sea. Both figure very important in trading in the period. And Central Asian tribes. It's all the way India, Tibet, and China. But this is really quite incredible for the period. Today, people look down on these maps and they feel like they're not very mimetic and they're not showing, jagged coastlines. And I just think that's an unfortunate way to look at them, because they're amazing for the period in which they were made. And this is what draws me to them all the time. Okay, so I'll give you a few specs on them. This is the same map, but an earlier version. This is 1285, the Egyptian world map. I love this. This is an amazing piece. And the one in the map from this manuscript is the Topkapi Sarai. The map from this manuscript, the Mediterranean map, also has this. Now, I don't know if you've heard about this, if there's any Byzantinists here in the audience, but right there, you see that little chain there? That's the chain guarding the mouth of the Bosphorus. They put it on the map. So, we hear about it in I don't know, in movies and stories, etc. But, they really did think of it as quite a significant thing, and they put it there on the world map, right? So there are, approximately 1,500, although I think now I have about 3,000, but from this particular set of the Al-Istakhri set, most of them are from the 11th to the 19th centuries, which is really interesting, right? I mean, when I say 11th to the 19th centuries, I mean the extant dates for them, right? We don't have earlier examples, although I have recently discovered an example from the 10th century that I will be writing and revealing at some point. But the bulk of the collection is 11th to 19th century, and really from the 13th century onwards is when they start to really proliferate, and you get multiple copies. And then the copies are made in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Anatolia, in India. And what I do is, instead of, as I said, going with the incorrect information of the original date of the author, which then you don't know that this was done in 1285, you don't know that the Ottoman cluster was done in the second half of the 15th century, you don't know these details. And I think it's really important, because I think the people who are copying these are putting their own ideas and sensibilities into the copies that they're making, right? And their understanding of the world around them and what was going on around them at the time. So they wonderful doorways into history. and very schematic, geometric, symmetric, these sort of the kind of iconic ideographs, right, that help us really think about the way in which the world was thought about. I need to speed this up. I have a lot of slides. So visual representation of the medieval Muslim perceptions of the world, copied with major and minor variations. It comes from this Book of Roads and Realms, Kitab al-Masalik or Mamalik tradition. I abbreviated it to KMS because one of the biggest errors in this understanding of Islamic cartography, which unfortunately continues to today, it makes me sad that I have not managed to eradicate this error, is a faulty attribution of the school of mapping to al-Balkhi. In fact, while working at Topkapi Sarai, I found only one manuscript which had al-Balkhi's name on it, and it's a very late manuscript. It's an 18th or 19th century copy. It could even be a forgery. It's a very dubious copy. So to peg the entire tradition to one very late manuscript in Topkapi Sarai just doesn't make any sense. It just, al-Balkhi was a hadith scholar. So this is a misnomer, and I try to remove it by saying this is the KMMS tradition, and instead of attributing it to al-Balkhi. So the text that surrounds it discusses the details of the Muslim world. There are usually 21 maps in very rigid format: world, Arabian Peninsula, Persian Gulf, Maghreb, Andalus, Egypt, Syria, the Mediterranean is the piece that I worked on before, Iraq, Iranian provinces, Sindh, Transoxiana, etc. And they constitute, the earliest extant atlas. We don't have anything like this earlier. We have some examples of ancient maps and some examples of ancient forms of attempts at mapping. We've got, Teo maps in the European context, which I'm about to get to. But this is the earliest known atlas, and there's not a single autograph copy from the original author. Okay, so, and as I said, I've done a redating of the tradition. Okay, now among the things that become very curious, when you spend a lot of time, as I have spent 3 decades looking at maps, among the things that come up that are fascinating is the allocation and the designation of space. So when you have a world map, even today, when you have a world map, even if it's on your screen or if it's in print, there's only a certain amount of space, right? There's a very famous book by Borges, where he says that the only real map, true, perfect map of the world that you can have would be a replica of the world that is the size of the world, that lies on top of the world. And so he has this really interesting story about this map that becomes full of these crevices and, people living under and above it that are on top of the world. It's very interesting. But, short of that, the way you deal with the world map is you have to decide what you're going to put on it. So well-known places like Egypt or Syria, or at that point, the Iranian provinces are very, very famous, etc. But what are these two guys doing on this map? These are a place called the Buja. And the thing that's so interesting about this is these guys have not one, but 2 births. They are listed here and here, here and here. I believe the next one they're listed here as well, right there. I'm going to get to that in a second. But I wanted to take you back to this because here we have, I discussed the Buja. So in my book, I wanted to just give you a quick sense of my book and what I do in it, and it's available at Chicago. You can get it digitally or in hard copy. And I've got another book, as I said, coming out in the Mediterranean, which I'm dedicating to Olivia Remy Constable. And then I've got books on what is Islamic about Islamic maps, and I'm very interested in Islamo-Christian cartographic connections. So I'm working on that as well. And then I'm very fascinated by time in maps, which is related to the Buja. But one of the questions that comes up, and I raised this in the poster for the talk, is the connections to the ancient tradition. So I've gone rather than go more modern and go into mimesis, I'm not someone who really chases mimesis a lot. I think that's why I work with these maps. I find the lack of mimesis much more fascinating. And so I do a lot of work with ancient maps. This is the tablet, a cosmographical map on the tablet of a sarcophagus in the Met in New York. You can go take a look at it. Fascinating piece. This is the Babylonian clay tablet. If anybody's ever been to the British Library, is the size of the palm of your hand. It's amazing, you know, and it has one of the earliest images of the world, and you can see an encircling ocean, and then these mythical islands and surrounding, and then this is the Persian Gulf right there, and the city-states. Some wonderful work has been done on that. I've looked at, you know, geometric patterns and Susan Bowles, Parvaneh will like this. I've looked at connections with the Zoroastrian tradition, Ahura Mazda, so, and the Sasanian tradition, you know, is this a ring or is this the world? I've wondered this and contemplated this. I mean, are they handing a ring or they're handing the world? Because at a certain point, the ring becomes an iconographic, you know, this ring is an iconographic symbol for the world because of the encircling ocean. You know, how should we see a bowl like this, a silver bowl surrounding the Sasanian ruler, for instance? You know, I've looked at the Zoroastrian tradition to understand how that relates to this depiction of the world, and to what extent is it coming out of that Iranian tradition, the ancient Iranian tradition? Because, you know, trying to understand the roots and the sources, looking at Indic influences, this is a making of a mandala, looking at Jain influences. I've had a lot of fun with this material. I you know, get the book and look for new books, but I wanted to take you actually to I've also looked at a lot at the connections with medieval European mapping, in particular, to what extent is it a spin-off from the TO, so that you can see, if you look at one of these maps, I've got that in a later slide coming up, but I just wanted to show you an example of the Buja. I've done it as chapters in this book. So there's lots of images here and lots of connections. I look, for instance, at the connection also in terms of looking at the Islamic connections, you know, to what extent are we seeing overtones of, you know, when we see something like the journey, heavenly ascent of the Prophet, when we have this encircling disc, is that related to the form of the world? And you have, you know, the reconstruction of the round city of Baghdad also has this circular format to it, and Qibla maps have that format to them as well, with showing the direction to the Kaaba. But I just wanted to get to the Buja. So here's the Buja. So I wanted to find out why these two births. So, you know, there's limited space on a world map, and two births are assigned to the Buja. And nobody, when I started looking at it, nobody had ever heard of the Buja. So that's another really interesting thing that I found with my work, was when I was working on the maps of the Mediterranean, there was an island in the Mediterranean which is called Tunis. And when I did my work in 1990, in the early 90s, in 1990, nobody knew what Tunis was. Nobody had heard about it. I went to I was in the library in Istanbul, and I met an expert on Egypt, and I asked him, I said, have you ever heard of Tunis? And he said, no. And I said, it's on the maps, and it seems to have been very significant. Why would it be on the maps? And within a decade, incredible work has been done on the port of Tunis and the importance of the port of Tunis. And that has come out. Now I don't have to do any work on it. It's become very obvious why it's on the maps. There's a very significant Fatimid port and Egyptian port, until it was conquered and destroyed by fire or by crusaders. Nobody knows, but that's why it was on the map. So I wanted to find out. And so this is a very interesting piece, looking at memory and the way memory ends up influencing mapping. Putting these, and the Buja, these people, the Buja, are still in the same spot that they were, and they're still forgotten. You never hear about them in the news. You don't hear about them in the history books. Someone may remember Rudyard Kipling's very racist poem. Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bear, but Fuzzy Wuzzy had no hair. So Fuzzy Wuzzy wasn't, I don't know if you grew up with that. He's talking about the Buddha. But even though people have probably heard that in childhood, they don't know that Rudyard Kipling was referring in very racist terms to the Buddha. Okay, so I have this whole thing on how Buddha captures imagination, etc. Now I'm going back to my slideshow. The other thing that I find really fascinating is this idea that we go from more mimesis to less. So the map on the left, the world map on the left, is the earliest extent of this particular KMMS tradition at Kapi Sarai. It's from 1086. And this is the mid-19th century, and this was done in Mughal India. And I'm actually been invited to do a talk and do some work on the South Asian Mughal interpretations of these maps. So I will be doing more on this. But I think that's another fascinating topic, which is why do we go from mimesis to less mimesis? You know, how these maps go from being the way they depict it. And this, for instance, it's very unusual. It shows various parts of the West African coast that we haven't seen before. As I said, these were the ancient routes I discussed with you earlier. And then this idea here, where it's actually, I wanted to go back for that. Okay, sometimes slides jump ahead. So this idea that, can we see also a relationship with the TO maps? And if we do we see this here like that? Is that the T and the O there? And do the Muslims then extend the map out in their depiction? And how does this impact European mapping? Because then we have the Crusades, and I think that we have to start seeing the development of medieval European mapping as an outcrop of Islamic mapping, that once they start coming into contact with the Islamic world during the Crusades, they're also coming into contact with their mapping traditions. And so you start to see, for instance, with the Beatus map, and there are many examples of this. I'm actually doing some very active work right now these days. I finished an article on this TO map that is labeled in Arabic, that's literally about to come out. It's I got the final corrections, and I said I have to wait until after this talk. So I've got some final galley corrections I put in, and then I'm also doing an online version of this with the virtual mapper group. They deal with medieval European mapping, but they want to bring Arabic and Islamic maps into the picture. So I'm working with them on that. And this is the first map that's going online, and I'll post that on my academia page. So if anybody wants to check in and check into looking at this actually online, like you can go to each spot, open it up, see the details, and all of that. Another thing that I find really interesting, so once we've left mimesis behind, right? We've dealt with mimesis, and now we can pack it away. Well, what if we take all the names off and we stop seeing this as a map of, the world showing the Arabian Peninsula, etc., and we step away from the names and we just start to see the form, and then the form is in the form of a bird. And so this is a really interesting question. Why is the world in the form of a bird? And there are many ways to approach this question. One of the ways, and I've published on this, I've got a piece that I published called "It's a Bird, It's a Plane, No, It's the World," if you want to take a look at it, in which I strip all the names off and identify the parts, so you can start to see how the form of the bird is embedded into this image of the world, right? So there's so many layers, so many multiple levels. And why a form of the bird, right? Why should it be a bird? And then I got very into Sufi texts and reading Neoplatonic renditions. And those of you who work in Islamic philosophy will know that Neoplatonic influences are very strong within the Islamic milieu at this time. And I think it comes into the maps. I think we start to see them in the maps. And it's another way of looking at them as, when I asked the question of what is Islamic about Islamic maps, so then we can start to look at things like, why is the map in the form of a bird? But then there's also the question of, the dove plays such a significant role in the Christian tradition. Is there a relationship between the dove and the adoption of the dove as of the bird as the image of the world? And I think there is, and I think I do have a connection, and it's something that I'm working on. And so, the relationship to the Brethren of Purity and the Ikhwan al-Safa and their ideas, which they bring on the cosmos and the world, I think influenced the mapping tradition. And then I'm going to kind of go probably bring it back down here. So bringing you back to remember that there are 21 maps in these things. In other words, there's multiple lifetimes worth of work, is what I've understood. So more and more now I'm seeking collaboration. If people want to work with me on something, I'm very interested in that. In this one, which I did on the Maghreb, I published this, the article is available. I looked at the way in which the angles of gaze work. So when you look at how does the gaze work, what are the emphases on the gaze, and how do we interpret that? And then I read this interpretation, and I also used Arabic poetry for this, nostalgic Andalusi poetry to interpret the maps. This is going back to the map of the Mediterranean, where I said I started all of this when I started my work with Olivia Remy Constable when I took a class. And I want to actually end, I think, with this segment, because I'm already quite, it's been quite a bit. I've got tons of images, tons of maps, and that's what I do. So one of the things that happened, and I want to talk about a different methodology that I brought to the table here, which is that I was working on this section of the map of the Mediterranean when the 2006 war broke out in Beirut. And I was busy trying to figure out some of these places. There are a whole bunch of places on this, Aulas, Ayas, which nobody has ever been able to. So on the one hand, these maps seem extremely simplistic, but on the other hand, there are tons of images on this that have never been identified below. My screen is partly hidden. Really? Which part of my screen is hidden, folks? Can you see that? Is there somebody who can, hello?
Yeah, it seems okay from here.
Okay, all right. So these places are mysterious. And so on the one hand, it seems very simplistic, but on the other hand, many of these places have never been identified. I think this might be a reference to Metropolis, actually, the ancient Metropolis. And I've gone and visited. So the war broke out, we had to evacuate. I was busy trying to figure this out. I'm like, what is this place here, which is somewhere close to Iskenderun? There's a place that was very difficult to identify. I identified this place, which is Akkar, and I believe it's the fortress of Arka, which is in northern Lebanon. I've actually been to ground. So that's the other thing that I do, is I actually go to ground. I found that there's only so much we can get out of the history books. There's only so much we can get out of the chronicles. Sometimes you have to go to ground. And so in light of what just happened in Turkey, I must say that I worked in this area with some amazing people. This is the area on the actual Islamic map right in here. The area of the famous Tugur between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Empire. And here's again that map. And here's something I was trying to figure out. Is this Majar Musa? Is it Hajar Musa? And actually I figured out it is, for those of you who know Arabic, it is with fa, and it's not a very nice word in Arabic, but it can also mean to cut, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure that I should say the F version of this. But I took this to a friend that I met in Hatay. And this is the area of where the earthquake hit recently. And the friend who helped me find this place died in the earthquake. So sad, so very sad. She helped me find this. I believe it's a reference to the tightest tunnel, Vespasianus's tightest tunnel, which and what I was showing before was how much fun it is. The whole village that we were staying, that I evacuated to, wanted to go help me find the place. So instead of renting a car to go find the place, we rented a bus, and half the village went with us, which was just wonderful. And so she took me, my friend took me, and she said, I know what this place is. And she took me to this tunnel. And it's about 2 miles long, I think, something like that. You can see an overview of it here. And what it does is it cuts through to a mountain called the Mount Musa of the area. And it cuts through to the port of Antioch to clear the silt, because the port of Seleucia Piera used to get silted up all the time. In fact, it's amazing that nobody's done any archaeological work there, because it must be a gold mine there from all the silt. So they needed a way to naturally clear out the silt, and this would have been one of the wonders of the world at the time, and it made its way onto the Islamic maps. It's so amazing. I've also been on ground to look at Misis. I have a new piece coming out on the Sugur and understanding the Sugur in the Islamic maps, and from that I figured out that Misis was the most fought over, most significant place in the Sugur. This is the one that changed hands back and forth all the time. I've also gone looking at the forts in the Cilician plains to try and understand the layout, because this was the big battlefield where a lot of the fighting took place. And then another place on the maps is this amazing place called Ain Zarba, and it's got this long wall. It's an incredible place. These are my photographs, by the way. That's why some of them are a little fuzzy, but I climbed up. It's an incredible climb. If anybody's ever in that area, and I hope it's still, I don't know what's happened following the earthquake. I'm seeing some chat signs. Is that okay? And then I've also been to Tarsus. I mean, just another amazing site. I don't know those of you who know this, but the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, very famous caliph, is buried here. And the funny story about this is nobody in Tarsus had any clue who Harun al-Rashid was. They were busy excavating a tomb of a famous saint, and they were like, what are you talking about, Harun al-Rashid? And then I walked all over the place and I found Harun's tomb. And the Abbasid caliphs, as they were coming to the end of their lives and they wanted to like have a glorious dying moment, they would go and throw themselves at go to the Sugur and go into battle and die there and be buried there. And this was a way to, get one last burst of for martyrdom, I guess. It's very interesting, right? And they didn't even know. It was quite something to find Harun al-Rashid's grave. And then I went searching, as I said, this place called Aulas or Ayas on the maps that has never been identified. I went searching for the ruins, and I wonder, could it be Eleusis Sebaste? Is that where we get Ayas? I'm actually now thinking more in terms of metropolis and the Olus being the end of it. So, a great part of what I do is identification. So as I said, alternate gateways into the past, wonderful, cartographic images, and that can be unpacked to reveal philosophy. So I think I'm quite over the time, so I should probably quit here. I have many more slides and more stuff if people want to look at. I mean, I've done work on using GIS to understand an image like this. I use GIS for maps. I've been doing that. Students have been influenced and do work with GIS. I have, this is something I've done with looking at a Qusair Amra, which is a very famous bathhouse, and this image that is being given by this angel to the seated figure here, who I think was the prince who spent a lot of time languishing in the bathhouse, Al-Walid II. And I think this is an image of the moon. And I've worked with GIS specialists in Western Michigan. It's amazing, the people who come forth to do work with me. And she did this amazing work with me. So yes, I think I should probably quit here and take your questions. So I'm not sure what happens next. Do I stop sharing?
Yeah, please stop sharing. And
Yes, Karen, we would like to see you now.
Can you see me now?
Yes, yes, very, very, very nice. Karen, I
I'm sorry
cannot.
I took too long. I went over time, but
No,
this,
no. I mean, it was so fascinating that I personally could listen to another hour of you talking. But I think there will be questions and answers. But before we start with I'm sure there will be plenty of questions and answers. I just wanted to tell you that I cannot begin to tell you how fascinating your work is. It is just incredible. It brings out so many issues, and it really helps contextualize. Oh yeah, you call it Islamic, and we're going to get to that. Contextualize what you're doing in world history, actually. So it is fascinating. Thank you so much for your talk. And I think I will not take. I have a lot of questions, but I think I will. Yeah, open the.
and I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity, because one of the things that it did for me as I was putting the talk together, and sort of seeing it in this, because I'm always giving specific talks on one topic or another topic, this way of trying to see the overview was fascinating for me too. I had not realized actually until I started to put it together how many different avenues I've taken, and the things that have emerged. I knew them, but I hadn't seen them collectively. So it was a very enriching. So thank you, Parvaneh,
You're
June,
welcome.
for the invitation. That's really kind of you.
No, we have to thank you. It's yeah, I mean, just congratulations. You're doing amazing work. You have been doing amazing work. This is just, I mean, speaking for myself, it's just incredible. I have goosebumps. Okay, but now I'm going to open the forum to discussion, and I hope that we could have your questions first. Questions from the audience. So I cannot see whose hand is up.
I can't see anybody, but I can maybe open the whole thing somehow.
yeah, I was going to say people are welcome to write their questions in the chat, or if they would like to speak them, they can also just write stack and then we'll add them to the list.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for. Yeah, this is perfect. Okay, so I think, Hans, did you have a question?
Somebody has put a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. That's great. Okay. So thanks so much for this very richly illustrated talk. I'd like to ask how you put together the two major approaches you spoke about today, your interest in non-mimetic world, and two, your work to identify specific cities, lands that correspond to the non-mimetic map you study.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating question. And actually, it gets back to this thing that I was trying to say, which is, I think that, when we say mimetic, when we think of mimetic maps, we're thinking of, when we start to get the earliest mimetic maps, so the map that is imprinted in our minds now, right? The map of the world that we think about, right? But actually, when you get past all of that and you take that out and you stop thinking of the world in the way that it's been imprinted in your mind, and you start thinking about, if you start looking at the world from south on top or east on top, or where, put different directions, that in and of itself starts to shake up your preconceived mimetic image. So I guess maybe what I'm trying to say is that preconceived image of the world that has been embedded, right? So when we start to see, for instance, I don't know if you know about the Spillhouse map. I don't know if you've looked at it, where Spillhaus, if anybody wants to do a search on the Spillhouse map, which is absolutely fascinating. Because what he did was he said, why are we focusing on the land masses? What if we focus on the seas? And then all of a sudden, the world is surrounded by the land masses and the sea is at the center. It's a completely different way of seeing the world. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it's about different ways of seeing the world, you cannot go by the sort of standard mimetic approach to evaluating maps, which is governed the history of cartography up until the present, to some extent to the present day, that people still, want to study the maps that look more like, with jagged coastlines, etc. Right? But then there's another side where when you get beyond mimesis, you can get into sort of what you could call ultra mimesis or extreme mimesis, where you can't really even tell what you're looking at, but it's extremely mimetic. So if you as I said, if you watch the International Space Station, I don't know if anybody's ever put that on. It's absolutely fascinating. Just leave it in the background while you're cooking or something, or doing something else, and then look up at it. And it's, because it travels around this known map of the world that we have imprinted in our minds, but then it's showing you like these segments, and the image coming out of the satellite is what we could call extreme mimesis. And it actually doesn't look very mimetic because you don't even understand what you're looking at, right? So there's this thing about, mimesis apparently requires you to understand what you're looking at, right? That there's a relationship there. So it's quite fascinating. And I really bounce back and forth between, these, the extreme mimesis that looks like no mimesis that meets over there. And so I think at that point, going to ground and actually identifying places on ground, there's a meeting there. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, there is a number of other questions coming up, Professor Pinto. Abby Limmer asks, and this was really interesting. Do you see a relationship between the TO maps and the Madaba map?
Yeah, I actually have, I don't know if I can show that now, but in my book,
yeah,
I do have the Madaba map, and I do talk about it. And one of the things that comes up when I do the Mediterranean, actually, when I focus down on to move from the broad world map and focus down on the regional maps, because there are all these regional maps that make up this atlas, right? Whether you want to call it Islamic or Islamicate, but this atlas of the world, this earliest atlas. Now, those maps have a kind of route-based system, right? One of the things I was actually talking to Parvaneh about this just yesterday. We were having a conversation, and I was saying to her, so as I mentioned at the outset, I came from SIPA, from the School of International and Public Affairs, where I was doing a degree. I was going to the UN and stuff like that. And we had some other people there with us. And Parvaneh remembers there was a very nice person by the name of Morrow. I don't know if Professor Bullitt remembers him, but he was there. He ended up being Hurowitz's assistant, and that was a very interesting situation. Now, Morrow, and I met him and I met his family. His mother's an American historian of science and technology, and his father is a Japanese artist. And when he invited us over to go for dinner to his place, they had the New York subway map up above the main room of their dining hall. And he explained that his father, the Japanese artist, was the first person to make an image of the New York subway map, the subway map that we use now. That was done by Morrow's father. So it had a very profound effect on me, because it started me thinking about how, we somehow think that maps are done by cartographers, but an artist, made this map of the subway map of New York, and this rendition of space, which is artistically laid out. And so the Islamic maps are like that, right? I mean, especially these ones of, Iraq, the various provinces, Egypt, all of these provinces, they're laid out like route maps, almost like subway maps. but instead of being of a map of a city, a map of a specific place that you would travel from one place to another. So the main points on your route, right? These route maps, which is embedded in the name. But it brought me to really thinking it was because I came to these maps. That's when I first started thinking about the connection between the subway map and these maps. And so I think it's a really fascinating connection, but
yeah.
I don't remember why I was saying
there
that
are
and who
other
asked me the
questions, so I
question.
want
I
to
got
get
lost.
to. I want to get to other questions. And for one thing, Zainab says, "Hi Karen, how well do you think the maps correspond to reality?"
Well, this gets to my question, which I was talking about with mimesis, right? When I sort of showed you how the maps correspond, and a lot of people look at maps in that way as to how it corresponds with reality. So I've done that. I unpack and show how you can see the world corresponding. I don't know if I can show a slide thing again, but if you go to my book, you will see I've got a lot of my work also in academia has translations of the maps. And those translations are related to its correspondence to the world as we know it, right? So that's one element of it. But then there's all these other elements where you can see birds and subway maps.
Yeah. So Jason, I'm sorry, Jason, please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your last name right. Jason Nink, who asked you about this non-mimetic and mimetic connection. He says that that's an absolutely fascinating paradox, much to think about. Thank you, Karen. So now there is a hand up.
I should say, and in response to that, that's why I spent 3 decades working on these maps, because they're so fascinating. It seems to be, and I keep thinking, have I reached the end? No, there's always some new there's some new mystery. There's endlessly fascinating, and I encourage a lot of people to work on this. I'm actually looking for ways to establish the collection somewhere. I'm looking for people who might be interested in housing it. So if anybody is interested in housing it, let me know, because I have 3,000 plus images and a lot of manuscripts. And I think it's important now as I look ahead after 3 decades of working on this and thinking, I've got probably another 2 decades of work, but it's important for me to make this material available. So I'm looking for a way. If anybody has any ideas, Western Michigan reached out to me. They were interested, but if anybody's interested, I'm looking for ways to preserve this collection and make it available, which is why I'm also now working much more towards creating online portals. Actually, I created, I've done so much work that with the internet, I had a major digital project where using Flash, was you could go and you could click on the maps and I don't know if anybody knows anything about Flash or Adobe Flash. Well, 2 years ago, they ended the program because they said there were too many avenues for hacking. And I lost all my work just like that. I can never play it again because the program just, we also have the internet and our lives with the internet and how programs just disappear. And suddenly, so now I'm looking for new ways to put it online, but I think making the material more accessible is really important. So.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, and I'm going to make sure to elaborate on it later on. But meanwhile, there is a question again from Johannes Thoman. Please go ahead, Johannes. Please unmute yourself and yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm a great fan of your book. And my colleagues are also great fan of your books. So I'm very happy to attend your lecture.
Thank you so much.
Now I have a maybe.
Where are you, Johannes? Could you tell me?
I'm in Zurich University.
Oh, how wonderful. Okay.
And I have a quite fundamental question which troubles me for some time. The question was, is a map. And if you look at Ptolemy, when he speaks about maps, he has not in mind illustrations of a book, but something different on a metal plate. Mm-hmm. And so actually, if you extrapolate that, we don't have Islamic maps from the pre-modern time. We have only illustrations of maps. And this troubles me a lot because I agree a lot about your redating of maps, that every copy is a new edition of it. But what's about real maps? Do you have a good answer to that?
I think the only answer is Borges. You know, this is why I go back to the story in Borges, where he says the only real map is the map that was made exactly, the exact replica of the earth at its size. You know, it's a wonderful story, a short story in Borges about this map and what happens to it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, one of the things that people also told me was the first person to draw maps. Well, not in the conventional, not in what you're thinking. And this question of what is a map, if you talk to historians of cartography, it is the #1 most perplexing question that is written about again and again and again. And I don't think that there will ever be a definitive answer to that question, which of course, you know, if you have to spend a lot of time in the history of cartography to understand the problem with answering that question. There is no single answer. There is no one answer. There is something that we somehow amorphously, you know, we think of maps, right? We think all the time of this is a map, and there's something in our heads that says this is a map. And you know, why is a subway map a map, for instance? If it's not an exact replica, right? It's just showing a route. Is a map only a map that is a tabular structure, you know, or a grid, or like you're saying again, astrolabe, for instance, you know, is that really the only actual map? You know, how do we deal with usage? You know, is nowadays when we talk about maps, when I teach a class on the history of mapping, students just think about it in terms of using the map to go from point A to point B, right? It's a map used for travel purposes. But in this period, I don't think the maps were used for travel purposes, because we know that they were very extensive travelers. We don't have a huge abundance of these. I don't think that with all the trading going on, that the camel caravans were using maps. They knew where they were going. This was just, for within maybe a classroom, or maybe a meeting of advisors, maybe at some imperial level. I don't know, maybe in libraries, where people sat down and said, oh, look, this is what the world looked like. We know where to go when we go, we know which direction we're going in, and all of those things. We're not using the map to actually travel with. So I think it's also that what is a map, and the concept of what is a map changes over time, and where you are in the world. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I think about why it is that I am so interested in maps, I think a lot of it has to do with growing up in Pakistan. There's not a big, now in America, there's more of an interest in maps because of GIS. But when I came here and I started studying the map, the geography departments were very small in this country. You didn't have geography classes in school. So some of it comes from where I grew up, right? And the experiences I had, which I brought to the table. So I don't think that fully answers your question, Johannes, but there is no answer. So I think that's the best answer to say. We don't know what is a map. It's an open
may I
question.
reply to that?
Oh yes, please do, please do.
The problem is, I'm not sure if in the pre-modern time in the Islamic world, if you would call a map, would say a map, that anybody would understand it as an illustration in a book.
No, because
but rather
even the names...
an independent piece of flat representation which is independent from a book. And so maybe the only existing real Islamic map of pre-modern time is the Portolan map in Milan. And therefore, it's problematic to call all the illustrations of maps. They are
I agree.
illustrations.
I mean, I agree. We but we say maps because what would we say to people now? If I just said image, right? So when you look at the manuscripts, right, they say Surat something or the other, right? So Surat Bahar al-Rum, or Surat the image of the world. I mean, the word is image. If I just said image, if I said medieval Islamic images of the world and overview, I don't know, it's part of it is also the language that we use to try to reach people, right, about what we're talking about. That the only way to reach people about an image that shows the location of places and spaces, we use the word map. But they weren't using map. Kharita, the word kharita, which is modern word for map, was not used. They don't use it at all in the titles of the maps. They're all called surat of whatever place, image of whatever place they're depicting. Surat al-Maghrib, there's just picture of that. So you're right to say that. But then what would you do? We end up in problems of language with everything we write. Yeah? Everything we put down, we can get into the problems of the meaning of the word that we're using. So the limitation we go with what people we think will understand we're talking about.
So, Karen, there is another question for you. Mete Chinar asks you, thank you for the presentation. I would like, this is in continuation of the Ptolemaic sort of arguments. I would like to ask the Ptolemaios influence, Ptolemy influence, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce it right, on the Islamic map making. I am going to ask you myself, why are you calling it Islamic map? And why did you say European as opposed to, versus Islamic maps? But that's another question. So, Mete wants to know the Ptolemaic influence on Islamic map making. Yeah.
Well, this goes back to what Johannes was also saying. This issue with Ptolemy, which is kind of embedded. It's like the image of the world that's embedded in our heads. Also, this idea that Ptolemy was the first map maker, and we don't know that at all for sure. I mean, because again, what is a map maker? What was he? We have no visual records. All the Ptolemy maps that are listed as Ptolemy, and it's an interesting thing that I think should get more coverage. Actually, they're all from the 13th century onwards. They're two major important Ptolemy manuscripts, and they're both in Topkapi Saray. They were in the Byzantine collection, and they're 13th century. So we have nothing, and those are the earliest extant. So we have absolutely no example of a map made by Ptolemy from the time period of Ptolemy. The only thing we have are these very late examples. And the question is, are they really Ptolemaic maps, or was this a misnomer that was applied, that this is maps of Ptolemy? And the scholars in history of cartography fall on either side of that divide. And I'm one who goes much more with the date of the maps. I believe that the date of the copy is crucial. You cannot say that these are Ptolemy maps and say that, more than a century after his death, we have Ptolemy maps. So this was, I think, a mistake, an error of the scholastic period, early modern period, where they start talking about Ptolemy as being the father of cartography, whereas in fact, he wasn't. So what we're really dealing with, I think, prior to Islamic mapping is what I showed a little bit in my book, where I start to look at some of the ancient examples, right? So I'm looking at things like the Babylonian clay tablet. In Egypt, you have some very, very amazing papyrus-based maps and sketches that go back to it's very interesting one of the route to Turin, the gold mine in Turin, for instance, which is a classic, looking at how you get to this gold mine. And it's sort of a route-based kind of image, if you want to call it image or a map, but showing you how to get there. That's kind of a basic definition of a map. So most of them, I would say there's no direct connection. And I think the idea that Ptolemy was the father of cartography, I feel is a myth, and it's not accurate. And it's based on these later copies. So that would be my best answer to you.
Nice. Yeah, that's part of the classical depiction, I mean, modern depiction of the classical world being the origins of all. Karen, I missed a very interesting, I missed a question, but the discussions are very interesting. This is from Jabod Abbasi, and he says, thank you for informative presentation. I am wondering if there is any difference between the pre-Mongol and post-Mongol maps produced in Iran in world maps, including view about the West. And I add to Jabod's question, why this proliferation in the post-Ilkhanid Mongol period? Go ahead, please.
Very interesting question, actually, and one that I have been wrestling with for a long time. There's no question that the proliferation is late. Now, what brings about the proliferation? Is it, by the time we get to the 12th century, 11th, 12th century, we start having the Crusades, is it the connections with the Crusades? Is the interconnectivity, because we start to see the medieval, now when I say medieval European, you're right, I should be saying medieval Christian, right? I mean, why is it called medieval European when in fact the TO map is much more religiously oriented than the Islamic maps, which should probably most likely be called Islamicate, right? There's all these terminology issues, and as we speak, as we write, we wrestle with them, right? So there's that side, and the symbiotic, I think there was a lot of interaction going on with the Crusaders and giving back and forth, because we start to see with the Christian maps, let's put them like that, but the Christian mapping, we start to see the Christian mapping advancing, right? They go from TO, which is just the Mediterranean and the Nile and the Bosphorus, whatever you think makes, they often, medieval European scholars will say the Tanais River, but I see it as the Bosphorus and the Nile making the T, and then the long leg is the head of the T, and the long leg is the Mediterranean. They go from that to, if you see like the Hereford Mappamundi, or some of these big Mappamundis that come about in the 12th and 13th centuries, you start to see the addition of the Red Sea. Then you start to get the Indian Ocean. Where are they getting this from? I think they're getting it from the Islamic maps right now. Can this be definitively proven? I think you can prove it through looking, comparing the maps. And that's something that I'm actually now putting a lot of time into, because I'm trying to work with scholars of medieval Christian maps. And I'm starting to do a lot of that. So there's that. But there's another side that I get very fascinated by, which is, when we're looking at the earliest extant examples, when we're looking at when this tradition starts, the earliest extant examples that we have, I have found now, I believe, a late 9th, early 10th century, somewhere in late 9th, early 10th century example, very unique. And then we know, I don't know if some of you have heard about this. There's a map, I didn't show it. It's called the Kashgari map. It's a fascinating map. It's in a small volume, the Divan-e-Lugat-ul Turk by Kashgari. It's in Millet Kütüphanesi, but I think now Millet Kütüphanesi, all the maps and manuscripts in Millet Kütüphanesi have gone into Süleymaniye's collection. And I did see it at the Millet Kitakhanesi when I was there. Amazing piece. So it shows you the world, and it's in my book. I mean, I could show it to you if you want, but if you find my book, you'll see I've got the Kashmiri map. And it shows the world with Central Asia and as the center of the world. So the map of the image of the world through whatever you want to, not necessarily map, you know, your image of the world is from Central Asia looking down. And all the tribes are arrayed around, and it's absolutely an incredible piece. Now, that copy, I believe that copy is 12th century, but it's supposed to have been done earlier by a Turk. So the question also lingers in my mind. To what extent is this tradition coming through the Turks coming down? So whether you want to say Mongols or you want to say Turks, you know, this coming down from Central Asia, right? So you're coming down from Central Asia through the Iranian lands, right? From between the Aral and Black Sea, which of course figures very prominently on these maps. And then eventually they end up in, one branch of them ends up in Anatolia, but of course you've got Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc. now. Which, by the way, for those of you who don't know Merv, you know, we know of Merv from Islamic history. Now it's Mary in Turkmenistan, and it comes up sometimes on the ISS, and I'm like, oh, Merv, you know. But to what extent is it coming with the Turks, right? So can we say Turks or do we say Mongol? And then the other issue is, to what extent is some of it being influenced by Chinese cartography? So now the Chinese cartographic tradition is very interesting. The Chinese cartographic tradition doesn't have a world map concept until quite late. You know, Zheng He, really, there's a whole debate about Zheng He, but you know, we're talking, you know, we don't really start to get world maps in the Chinese context until about 14th century or so. So it's somewhere in there. I don't want to give an exact date. Prior to that, what you have very early on, like the earliest example of a map and of paper is in the Chinese context from the 3rd century BC, right? From late Han. And it's got, it looks like it's kind of like a line, again, like this route map, like the map to the gold mine, you know, it's one of these, you know, tiny local, so they develop a lot of local route maps. They're mapping out estates and lands that are owned by people, you know, so it starts off very small. And then eventually by about the 9th century, you start to get a complete image of Chang'an, which was the capital at that point, and you start to get this incredible. And it looks like the inside of a transistor radio. It's like one of these things you have in your computer. You know, it's so tiny and the places are so well defined. So to what extent, I mean, in the Western European Roman context, you have much more big world mapping. So to what extent is this a coming together of these traditions, right? I remember once there's this very famous historian of cartography by the name of Christian Jacob in Paris. He's unfortunately retired now, he's not writing but he wrote some of the most amazing work on theoretical work on mapping and thinking about maps. And I was at a conference, my first history of cartography conference in Athens in 1999. And he was this main speaker, and I was sitting there, and he said, now what if we take and we add a drop of Chinese mapping, and then we add a drop of ancient Greek, and we add a drop of Roman, and we add a drop of, you know, and what do we get? And I said, you get Islamic mapping, you know, because if you look at the way in which the Islamic world is located, right, it's located at the heart of all these lines of communication. So it seems natural that it's coming together, and you have the flowering of this tradition, which is bringing these different strands together. So I don't know if that answers fully your question, Jawad, but it gives maybe more answers.
Karen, I was given a prompt that we should stop in 5 minutes, but I'm going to take, and we will, But I have to take the privilege of the chair and ask you a few questions, and I ask you to kindly make it short, your replies short. And I mean, there's so many questions that I have, for one thing. Okay. The first question, well, a comment and then a question. First comment is whether or not you have considered that the round shape of these maps indicates the sun.
Yeah, well, you know,
The
the sun.
reason I
or
ask
the-
you was
Hmm.
because, you know, as you know, the Susa is one of the first round cities, and I have no doubt that that was reflecting the sun. I mean, the Mesopotamian map also is a round map, and with surrounded Sumerian map, yeah, surrounded with water. I think that makes sense because, you know, they
Absolutely.
are where they are, and they are actually surrounded with water. But, you know, given the pre-modern travel, nobody would know that there's you know, there's water all around. Yeah. And
So I use in my book, you've seen, I do some of I try to go back to the Susa models and I try to look at that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want me to give you a quick answer. So it's something I've thought about a lot. And of course, you can't spend all this time. I haven't thought about the sun, but I have thought about the moon. I don't know how much you've thought about the moon.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, if you think, you know, here we are sitting here, you know, we have no satellite, no telescope, no nothing, right?
Yeah.
So how are you going to see the way in which the world looks?
Yeah.
And, you know, there's this idea that this is, of course, you know, it's a pre-modern idea that the moon was reflecting
Yeah. Yeah.
the world.
Yeah.
So if you see the moon and you see the forms of the moon,
Yeah.
are the forms of the moon a reflection of the world?
So
And I think that there is a
yes.
parallel. I think actually, if
Yeah.
you start looking at some
That's
of these
excellent.
early pre-telescope, pre-satellite maps,
Yeah.
you can start to see a connection actually
Yeah.
between the form that you see on the moon
Yeah.
and the form in the maps. Now, I hadn't thought about sun. I
Okay, but
will think about that. So thank you about that. But
yeah, for me, that's very, very interesting. I have a possible potential answer to this bird business, but I will tell you in private. The other, very fast, please. This is very, very important. What is Islamic about this Islamic maps? You know, the reason I'm asking is we're very, very fond of throwing Islamic this and that all over the place, right? Especially when it comes to Western Asia and Africa. Yeah. So what is Islamic about the whole thing?
well, this is why I started, and I've got this piece that I'm supposed to. I've been working on the small book on this, which I'm hoping to send out. You know, what was said for a long time and is quite written up on is that there's nothing Islamic about Islamic maps. That they're just called Islamic, but that if you look at Islamic maps, it's not like, you know, the T and the O, which looks like the body of Christ in a host, you know, that has been related to that. There don't seem to be a lot of overt symbols of Islamicness. But then I think, and this is where I was trying to, now I think, you know, there's definitely, you know, we have Qibla maps. So those are much more Islamic, if you want to say, or we have maps showing the tile maps of the Kaaba. Now, the interesting thing about Mecca and the depiction of Mecca and Medina and the Kaaba is that we don't get those until about the 14th, 15th century depictions of the holy sites. And then once it picks up, it's just like it's through the roof. Now you have
right.
You know, the number of images, but it starts off actually in tile format. Some of the earliest images of Mecca and the holy city is in tile format. And so you have this done on a tile and embedded in a wall or in the direction towards Qibla. And of course, you get this. But then you got astrolabes. David King deals with that and the whole history of astrolabes and the way in which you find the direction to Mecca, right? Which is, you know, if you're a good Muslim and you want to pray 5 times a day, you need to know which direction you're praying in. And that, I think, adds a whole other dimension, because, you know, most of us, right, when I say, where are you looking north, south, east, or west, you don't know immediately at that point, right? You take out your phone or something. But Muslims are Muslims, so many, I mean, because devoted Muslim prays 5 times a day, has to know the direction to Mecca, right? So once you know the direction to Mecca, then you can figure out generally where you are, right? Which direction you're facing. It's a fascinating issue. But how does that apply to these atlas images, these atlas illustrations?
Oh, okay.
And there I have developed this question where I've said, okay, most people don't see anything Islamic about them. But I think you can, if you dig deep enough, you can find them. They're not overt, but they're covered, right? So you've got the bird image, for instance. You know, what is the relation to bird? And I'd love to talk to you about that. Yeah?
I don't think the bird is Islamic, Karen.
But it's adopted, right?
Yeah,
it's
exactly,
adopted into it, because you get the most of this stuff is coming from different directions. It kind of comes and kind of melds into Islamic culture, right?
Yeah.
But but still you get it now. You get it in the Ikhwan al-Safa, you get it in Sufi discussions. So it starts to filter through, right?
Yeah.
In form of the form, I don't know if you've seen, I've got this piece. I actually have a version of it I didn't show, but I have an article out on looking at the forms of the seas.
Okay.
So why is the sea for the Persian Gulf in the form of a tooth? It looks like it's in the form of a tooth. To some extent, it's also resembling the form, but it's also not. I mean, it's a very deliberate tooth-like structure. And then there is the form of the Mediterranean, which is round like this, almost like a fish, but could also look like the print of the sandal of the Prophet. So to what extent are these related to, you know, ideas of the prophets?
That's fascinating.
Are they embedded in this map? You know, can we see this as, you know, if it's his tooth, then does that mean that the Persian Gulf gets priority over the Mediterranean, which is his sandal print?
Yeah. So we have two more questions. Let me see whether Meryl allows us to go a little bit more, because there are 2 questions, Meryl. Yeah, thank you so much.
Meryl, thank you so much also for all that you've done. So, really appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this too. You know, it's just such a great privilege and honor and such a wonderful experience. It's been wonderful for me to just think about this overview. So.
Karen, the one thing that I wanted to tell you is this is so fascinating, and all the stuff that you have. I mean, it definitely. I mean, I will collaborate with you if you ask me. Yeah. So there are.
By the way, I see Heather Watcher here. We're doing work on medieval European or Christian maps, as you want to call them. But we're doing some collaborative work. So I think collaboration is the way to go.
Yeah, and
as you realize that this is so much work, right?
Yeah. I mean, this deserves to be really, you know, worked on, and we were talking about this. It's you know, it's so much that there's such a treasure that it needs to be worked on by a group of people. So I hope, besides me, you will find a lot of collaborators. I hope
Please,
so.
Anybody interested in collaborating, reach out. I would love to hear about your interests and what we could do together, because there is a lot of material. I have a lot of material to share. Yeah. And I've come to understand that it's not one lifetime, you know, it's multiple lifetimes of work is what I have really come to understand about this. So
absolutely, we need 5 Karens. Yeah, 5 more Karens. But no, but
and another
1
5
Karen is doing the job tremendously. But Karen, okay, getting to the questions. Fariba Zarinabov, hi Fariba Jan. She's very kind to us always. She wants you to bring in, please, the discussion of Ottoman maps by Piri Reis and Matrakci. Please keep it short, but go ahead, because we really not more than a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Fariba Jan, and thank you for coming. I find it fascinating because I think that in the Ottoman case, the way I see it, is it's a feeding off again of multiple traditions, right? So on the one hand, you've got the Islamic tradition coming in with some of the, you know, especially with Matrakchi, you used to see the route-based system in the images, right? From one, the whole thing is based on a trip, right? So this one trip and how you go from one city to another place, and the way it's laid out, right? That's very much. But then you get this 3D version, right? That you get with Matrakchi, but you also get with some of the other maps that are being produced, where you get this kind of 3D vision, almost like you got the flat route map, but you've also got the walls and all the, you know, the way that the structure is laid out is fascinating. That I think is unique, you know. I mean, for instance, I mean, people talk about Matrakchi and they talk about Piri Reis. I've written a piece on Piri Reis, by the way, and looking at the connections between Islamic cartography. I think, you know, that's something that's missed, or Islamicate cartography and Piri Reis. There are a lot of connections that are missed. But what I think is absolutely fascinating, and nobody does any work on this, is the Suharitalar. Have you seen the Suharitalar? It's just mind-boggling, you know. These are the maps that were made of the water system, both water and sewer. I don't see any example prior to the Ottomans of mapping. Of course, now it's crucial. I mean, you ask anybody in any city or any urban area, they need to know the layout of the sewer system and the layout of the water system.
Karen,
But I think those are the first ones, and so I think they take it to a different level, and then they merge also with early modern European mapping, so that influence comes to bear as well. You can start to see that with Piri Reis, etc. So I think that's,
Karen, actually, what is really fascinating for me, Matrakchi's maps are of the Persian campaigns of Suleiman, you know, and it's all these towns, including that of Tabriz in 1535, that he draws, you know, on the route of the campaign, including, you know, Baghdad and all the little ones, the fortresses. It's just really amazing, and we need several books on that. No one has studied the whole collection. And so it kind of maps Iran, you know, of course, you know, Iraq. It's the only one we have with these amazing.
Matrakchi is amazing. Matrakchi is totally, and what happens is people focus a lot more on the Istanbul rendition that the Matrakchi does and leaves out the rest of the trip. Let me just add one thing. I'm finishing another piece that's actually coming out quite soon on the map in the Tomare Humayun for Sultan Suleiman. It's a big scroll, and there's the map, and it's also again a kind of a hybrid. It's fascinating, showing things like the location of Poland as you know, Bilad Anka, you know, things like that, you know, just amazing, you know, the land of the beloved, you know. It's just amazing. But I love the fusion that comes with Ottoman maps. But you're right. I mean, Matrakchi, Nasu, and the water maps. I mean, the water maps are mind-blowing. Mind-blowing.
This is I mean, all that, Karen, I cannot, I mean, it's incredible. But okay, we have to finish. But I just want to make a couple of points that people made. Professor Thoman, whom I hope will invite you for collaboration if they are so such a fan of your work. It asks you a tiny, I mean, tells you a tiny footnote that Greek philology, and don't answer it now, please. I'm just, yeah. Greek philology has shown that we can construct the illustrated maps in the manuscript tradition in late antiquity, which was the source for the Arabic geographical tradition. So this from Professor Thoman.
I have to say one thing, only one thing, Parvaneh. There's not one single source for Arabic. It's very important to understand that there's not one, there is influences, definitely, I'm sure there is influences, but there's not one single source, because the maps are so varied and so different, you cannot peg it to one source. So
yeah, and you don't have to answer this either, but I have to tell you, Professor Jeffrey Spur, I'm sorry, Jeffrey, that has also said wonderfully stimulating, Karen. On this last point, would it make any more sense to call these maps Muslim rather than Islamic? Yeah. Well, okay.
Can I just
have-
respond to that very quickly?
yeah,
There's
yeah.
some maps that are not done by Muslims. So some of the copies are not done by Muslims. So I stayed away from just saying Muslim maps, because then how would you deal with copyists who are Jews, or who are,
Yeah.
there's some Jewish copyists. So
Yeah. We
so,
can use
I think
dynastic
Islamic
names.
Kate may make a better sense. Like these were produced during the
Okay.
administrative.
Okay, there are important points that I have to bring out. Okay, Professor Thalman says, yes, I would be very much willing to cooperate. So I suggest you get in touch with him, and you both of you together. And then Zainab Saidzadeh asks to, can I have your email address? I want to get more information from you for my thesis. And
I just put it. So there's my
okay,
email address.
okay, that's great.
I'm mapsgal@icloud.com. That's my permanent email address.
Yeah, and you have gotten quite a few accolades for this
Oh,
fantastic,
thank you.
amazing talk, Karen. It was really very, very informative, extremely exciting for your future work, the works that
Thank you,
are
Parvaneh.
yet to come
And
out.
Parvaneh, June, I hope we will do some work together. We're going to talk and discuss mutual
Sure.
interests. And I
Sure,
thank you
sure.
again so much for the honor of this invitation. It was
Sure.
so nice of you,
Thank you
so
for
kind of you. Thank you
accepting
so
it.
much.
Thank you, everyone, for staying with us for such a long time. I mean, not because it's so fascinating. And I wish I could invite you again and again, but okay, we have to get to other people too. So thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thank you,
coming. Thank you
everybody,
so
for
much.
being with
Thank
us.
you for your
Thank
questions and your
Thank-
interest.
Thank
And
you.
Fariba, we should do something. We should think about maybe ways in which we can merge our interests.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye bye.
Have a great day,
Have a good
everyone. Have a
Friday.
great day. Oh, our